And, the Tommy Robinson demonstration was very threatening, of course, to young Muslims, to women.
So in France, for example, they banned hijab for schoolgirls. We just had the killings in San Diego.
We're at the moment in, post-Brexit Britain.
Your main concern would be the Americanization of British culture, the complicity in the genocide, the kind of privatization of public institutions like the NHS.
I'm here under the invite of Emiratis, who I'm meeting tomorrow to discuss terrorist organisations in the UK.
Like the UAE, who are actually funding organisations linked to Tommy Robinson.
Actually, we should have been listening to our African American Muslim brethren who were telling us racism eventually leads to annihilation.
Professor Salman Sayyid, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the Thinking Muslim.
Assalamu alaikum, and I'm glad to be here.
It's great to have you with us. Now, today we're going to talk about Islamophobia, really within the context of what we saw a few weeks ago. There was a far-right demonstration here in London, not far from where we're sitting at the moment, and Tommy Robinson led that demonstration. I would like your comments on just the sort of the spectacle of racist individuals coming together in large numbers now across Europe, but in particular here in London. And there was a group of women who unveiled themselves on the stage. And it came across as very dehumanizing and a symbolic act, I suppose, of what they would call as resistance against Islam. So that's a very long question, but I suppose the question really is, how do we understand what's taking place here, this phenomenon of the rise of Islamophobia across the West?
I think we have to understand Islamophobia is not just a Western phenomenon. It's become a global phenomenon, and we can investigate that later on. But to take the example of the women being pretending to unveil themselves, and that has a very old history. I mean, for example, when the French colonized Algeria, they had these parties or these kinds of major occasions, public unveiling. And they had a huge propaganda campaign about, women should be unveiled, et cetera, And so as part of that, they would get Algerian women and they would veil them in public as a way of trying to civilize them. And I think that's obviously harks back. Now, I'm not saying that any of the people in Unite the Kingdom had any inclination of what may have happened before or not. But I do think it's interesting that you see that these things have a certain kind of familiarity and a certain kind of similarities that transcend that. So in a way, it's always interesting to me that whenever people are being racist, there's a familiar way that they're being racist. It doesn't matter what they are or when it is. There's a similar kind of vocabulary, similar kind of gestures, similar kind of things that they point out, etc. So that shows that continuity in a way, which they may or may not be aware of, but it just shows to show that racism itself and Islamophobia, as I argue, is a type of racism, has these familiar shapes. So it shouldn't be surprising that you have these unveiling episodes. If you remember, a few years ago, there were all these mainly French actresses who cut their hair in protest at some of the things that were happening in Iran. Again, it was, as people have many noted, when Gaza was being, and still is being, bombed, etc., you didn't hear so much about those kinds of issues. So there's a whole kind of a valid tradition about public unveiling, about looking at the vulnerability of Muslim women. Afghanistan, was invaded ultimately to free Muslim women. So it shouldn't be surprising. It's just the crassness of it that shocks us. And then it is also important for us to know that this comes from a very, it is something which has happened many times and continues to happen. And the kind of obsession about how women are dressed, how Muslim women are dressed, is very, very one of the kind of main tropes of Islamophobia. But it also comes to something older, though. So first, take someone like Lord Cromer, who was the governor, proconsul of Egypt in the 1920s. And while he was there, he was in the forefront of a campaign against the veil for Egyptian women. And he seemed to be kind of like, and he was doing this on the grounds of, modernizing, civilizing. When his term of office finished, he goes back to Britain and becomes the president of the Society Against Women's Suffrage. So he didn't want Muslim women to be veiled. So you would think, okay, this is a feminist or proto-feminist gesture. But when he comes to Britain, he also doesn't want women to have the vote. So you can have these two kind of very contradictory positions quite easily. And again, you'll notice that those who are asking Muslim women to be unveiled are also then not necessarily having the most kind of feminist credentials on other issues.
I mean, I was rereading Muhammad Assad's Road to Mecca, Leopold Weiss, of course, who converted to Islam. And he talked about in his introduction how Islamophobia, or this antagonism towards Islam, is deeply rooted within almost a Western psyche. And it really stems from that long period of animosity during the Crusades. And the argument he puts across, I mean, this is back in whatever 1920s, 30s, the argument is that that the West almost fed generation by generation. It's almost within the DNA of Westerners to have this antagonism towards Islam. And like, how much do you buy into that sort of generational animosity towards Islam?
I think my kind of concern about those is that it's always easy for many people to start thinking, well, Islamophobia starts from the beginning of Islam itself. So you can say the first Islamophobes were the Quraysh or Iblis or Abu Lahab or whoever you want to pick there. But I think that kind of stretching of making Islamophobia something constant is not helpful, partly because I don't think that's what Islamophobia is, but it misses out one of the most important things about Islamophobia right now. And Islamophobia right now works in the context where the ability for Muslims to write their own history, to exercise their own agency, to make their own decisions is heavily, heavily limited. And that's very, very different. So even if there was antagonism and hostility during the time of the Crusades, in the end, the Muslims won the Crusades. And the Crusades were only possible because of Muslim disunity. Once the Muslims were reorganizing themselves, it was over. So there was a different relationship of power and authority. And I don't think we should stretch that away, because what that does is make it look like this has always been the case, and therefore there's nothing for us to do about it. It becomes another version of the longest hatred. And I think we have to look at the actual circumstances that have allowed Islamophobia to emerge in the present kind of context. I don't think there's any point in talking about the Quraysh as being the first Islamophobes, because it makes no sense to me to simply see it in relation to only there's a hostility or not, because there's also periods when there isn't hostility. There's kind of a very mixed kind of record on these things. So for me, it's really, really important that we understand the specificity of Islamophobia and see what is it that makes it different. And I would say that one of the primary conditions of Islamophobia is the fact that it occurs in the context where the Muslim ability to exercise their own sovereignty, to exercise autonomy collectively is heavily circumscribed.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is your brother Mazen Mukhtar, the CEO of Bayt al-Mal. The month of Muharram is the first month of the year and one of the 4 sacred months mentioned in the Quran. It is a time of reflection and remembrance and recommitment to faith. Let us turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this month and seek His mercy through charity. You can provide emergency aids. You can provide food, clean water, shelter, education to families who pray for relief. May Allah accept their prayers through the compassion of our donors through you. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Please visit btml.us/thinkingmuslim to donate now. That's interesting, because you've written a book called Recalling the Caliphate, where you talk about Muslim sovereignty and how almost the Caliphate remains this sort of ghostly presence that until today, 100 years or 100 years plus after the destruction of the last Caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate, Muslim sovereignty today remains elusive, and our disunity is pretty clear, especially when we see what's happening in Gaza. Just talk about that. What is it that what is the connection, I suppose, between Muslim sovereignty on one hand and Islamophobia on the other?
I think Islamophobia and Muslim sovereignty, Islamophobia is only really possible in the absence of Muslim sovereignty. Because what it means is that you don't have the ability to counter it effectively. And that's what allows it to thrive. It allows it to become dominant in many, many different walks of life, etc. So that's the first kind of issue that we need to understand that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you could illustrate this argument in different ways. If you think about the Caliphate as simply a political entity, then it's hard to imagine that a state that would have included now what is not just Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, would not be a significant player on the world stage. Hijaz, I mean, would have been a significant actor. But more important than the kind of the geography or the geopolitics of it is really the idea of what it represents. And in a way, what the Caliphate represented is that in this world, there would be some mechanisms for Muslim aspirations, Muslim concerns to be heard and to be taken seriously. So in a sense, there would be some kind of sense of Muslim great power that can actually do that. Right now, one of the biggest problems is this, and we see this in Gaza, who is willing or able to actually act on behalf of Muslims? So that, it seems to me, is what is one of the main conditions for Islamophobia, that there is no cost to being an Islamophobe.
Yeah.
There is no international or very weak international condemnation. There's no kind of mobilization of resources around that. And you see the kind of ways in that, in the sense that, the Muslims are the wretched of the earth in a way. And it's not just, what's happening in Gaza, but look at the Rohingya. What was happened to, now, Burma is not a very strong, very big country, whatever.
Yeah.
But what could be done? So I think these are the sort of issues where sovereignty and Islamophobia are linked. One of the ways of thinking about Islamophobia is really a mechanism for disciplining and regulating how Muslims is expressed. It's basically a way of regulating Muslim agency. So that's the real heart of Islamophobia. It's determining what is and how you can or cannot be a Muslim, which goes back to the thing about if there are Muslim women who wish to wear the hijab or they wish to wear the niqab or the burqa or whatever, then why is it that needs to be regulated by other actors who have no stake in the system? They have no stake in Islam. So I think that's why those things are connected, because in a way, Islamophobia points to a loss of power, and sovereignty is the ability to actually make decisions which are empowered.
Now, when we talk about Muslim sovereignty and our ability to link a cost to Islamophobia, of course, what we have is many Muslim countries, or some Muslim countries like the UAE, who are actually funding organizations linked to Tommy Robinson, who are working with the Israelis to promote Islamophobia and target Muslims across the Western world and beyond. I mean, how do you see the role of very bad actors, malign actors like the UAE in this process of fermenting Islamophobia across the West?
I think, look, it's really, really important to see what's being done in Abu Dhabi is not that different from, for example, what was done by Mustafa Kemal in 1924. The abolition of the Caliphate was a decision made by Mustafa Kemal. It didn't have to be made. We don't know what would have happened otherwise. So, but in a sense, what Kemalism did, and if you think of the changes that Mustafa Kemal brought in the first decade, so for example, replacing the azan with from Arabic to Turkish, demolishing mosques, all kinds of changing the holiday from the week from Friday to Sunday, changing of the script, changing people's names. So, all of these things happened under a kind of a project in which and here, to simplify things, Mustafa Kemal and his colleagues basically understood that, look, how we become modern is by being Western. And to be Western, we have to de-Islamicize. Now that, it seems to be that logic of Kemalism is something that has haunted all Muslim societies since then. And you have this constantly, in some cases more powerful than others. So for example, when you have in Tunisia, in the 60s, government decides that we will ban fasting for economic reasons. So the idea is that if you're fasting, you can't be economically productive. You can have multiple kind of efforts. The effort on, for example, banning, Mustafa Kemal bans the hijab, and there in Iran, Reza Pahlavi tries to ban the hijab. All of these. So very, very similar kind of, almost a toolkit of how to be a post-Caliphate Muslim society. And that, I think, is really crucial for our understanding why countries like the UAE and others want to support Islamophobia, because for them, they're basically Kemalist regimes. They want to build a different kind of society. Right. And for them, what is in the way of building that kind of different kind of society along a Western template is their own idea that to be modern, you have to de-Islamicize. And that's what drives their Islamophobia. And, they have been some of the most pernicious supporters of Islamophobia, not just in terms of Tommy Robinson, but look at the attempts to ban the Muslim Brotherhood, the funding of really, really horrific forces against Muslim lives and livelihoods. So it's not just name calling. This is really about also kinetic violence on a mass scale.
Yeah. Now, you've written a lot about Islamophobia, and you've described the Muslim body as having become racialized. How does the targeting of Muslim women's dress and other such forms of targeting that are very much against the bodies of Muslims fit within this process of racialization?
The racialization is really how you bundle together a number of features to form some kind of idea of a particular group. So we're very used to the idea of thinking that a race is a biological construct, something biological. Right. But if you think about it for a moment, race has never really been biological. And one of the problems that the early race science ran into, they couldn't make up their mind how many races there were. Sometimes they would say there were 4, sometimes they would say there were 8, because originally the idea of race started off with the idea that it would be similar to species. And one of the things about species is that they can't successfully have progeny, right? The trouble is this, that if you look at everywhere there was racism, they would have these huge penalties for relationships across racial boundaries. Why would you need those penalties if this was not really a possibility, right? So in a sense, there was no attempt to see that races themselves were being constantly constructed. So you would then have certain features were said to be racial, belonging to a group, but these were constantly being articulated in different ways. So for example, take the issue about the hijab becoming a marker of Muslimness, right? Now it's the hijab which is a marker of Muslimness, or the beard becoming a marker of Muslimness. So in France, for example, they banned hijab for schoolgirls, basically, right? And now there's a campaign to ban long skirts, because that becomes a marker of Muslimness. Yeah. So what is a marker of Muslimness can be very, very mobile in its time. So the idea of racialization is how you make something into a race by using different kinds of, sometimes different kinds of features. Some of them may be on the body, some of them may be cuisine, some of them may be dress, but you bundle them together to say this is what a racial group, or this is what a racial group is, and you can identify it. And even though you could argue, well, look, of course, everyone says Muslims come from all kinds of backgrounds, from Africa, from Asia, etc. But when you go through airport security, how is it that regardless of where you come from, you now have people who are trained to spot a Muslim. And often they're Muslims themselves.
Really?
So in a sense, that's how the racialization has worked, in a sense that you can actually read what a Muslim is from a period when people couldn't tell what a Muslim was or not.
Yeah.
And it's those markers. So the first a person to get killed in retaliation for 9/11 was Balbar Singh Sodhi, a Sikh man. Why did the racist kill him? Because he thought he was a Muslim. Why was he considered Muslim? Because he had a beard, because he had a turban. Now, people from South Asia would know there was a different kind of turban or whatever, but those were the markers that he was using. Now, it is possible if he didn't have a turban, didn't have a beard, he might have not been identified as a Muslim. He did not ask him questions about, does he accept the Prophet? What are the 5 or 6 pillars of Islam or anything like that? There was not a theological kind of debate with him. It just simply said, okay, that looks like a Muslim. And I think all people now have experienced that you have a situation in where something looks like a Muslim is something that's quite real and identifiable.
So you've argued that Islamophobia is a form of racism, and that's and you've explained that there. But the common response to that is that Islam is a religion, not a race, and religions are codes of practice. They're bodies of ideas, and surely practice and ideas should be susceptible to question. And so there is a distinction being made here between race, color, and ideas. I mean, how do you?
Yeah. Well, firstly, I'm not sure when you call Islam a religion. I think it's really interesting because, for example, if you look at the first kind of English translations of the Quran, they occurred before the word religion actually circulated. So how do they define Islam then? So when you see, if I asked any Muslim now, if you ask them, what does deen mean? They would say, it means religion. Yeah. Well, how did it become religion when there was no concept called religion? So when you look at the first translations, they actually don't talk about deen. They don't talk about deen being a religion because they don't have that. They say holy law or law. Right. Now, if you think of Islam as a law, or if you think of Islam as nomus or custom, which is the word, it completely changes our understanding of it. And it changes our understanding of what deen is. There's no reason why we assume deen means religion. It's only now that we become that. And the other problem, of course, is that there is only one religion. And please edit this carefully. What I mean by that is that religion was actually a Christian category. So for a very long time, when there was study of other faiths or other customs, they were not deemed to be religious. They were deemed as Christianity was the religion, and Islam was considered to be either heresy or some kind of deviation or something like that. So even the concept of religion itself is quite contested. Now, when they say, okay, it's a body of practice, it's a body of ideas and things like that. Well, let's go back to the Tommy Robinson Unite the Kingdom March. Some of your viewers may be aware of there was a person who went on stage and she said, I want to get Islam out of these buildings. I want to get Islam out of every position of authority. She never used the word Muslim. She kept on saying Islam. Now, I'm not sure if there's any Muslim watching that would be reassured. This was only a dispute about ideas and practices, etc. What did they actually mean? To get Islam out of this building or Islam out of the office. So I would say to you, this is a bit of a red herring that a lot of the opponents or a lot of Islamophobes use, that, Islam is about thinking and debate, etc. None of the issues that we've talked about are really about theological disputes about whether God is one or three. These are not, I don't think in Unite the Kingdom or the Hindutva or others, Christian nationalists, are really disputing that. So the idea this is simply about the dispute about what you think religion is, and people can critique that or whatever. The libraries are full of books critiquing this. There are debates that go on among theologians all the time around these issues. So to make that distinction between race is something which is about color and you can't change your color, well, the problem is that it's not clear that race is about color in a sense that because in different contexts, color is not as powerful marker of race. Other markers are used. So, for example, why did the Nazis have to have a whole science institute to identify Jews? Because often they couldn't work out someone who was Jewish through the color of their skin. But that did not stop them killing 6 million Jews. So they had to work out how to do that. And they'd focus on different ways of thinking about how to identify this. So I would just be very cautious about reducing race to simply a natural occurring construct or a natural occurring phenomenon. If it was a natural occurring phenomenon, you wouldn't need so much energy invested to policing it.
There are a number of Muslims who argue that maybe some of the grievances that people like Tommy Robinson feed into are actually valid grievances. I mean, we're at the moment in post-Brexit Britain, and there is a feeling amongst white people, I suppose, here in the West that their cultures have been diluted, and at the same time, Islamic cultures or Muslim cultures are being promoted, or at least are strengthening. The Muslim family, the Muslim mosque presence, the Muslim sort of community gatherings are increasing in number. We have, alhamdulillah, despite our problems and challenges, we still have very cohesive communities. So, there are some Muslims who point to that, and non-Muslims who point to that and say that maybe there is a valid grievance there, that white Britain feels that its cultures have been introduced, whereas Islamic cultures are valued in this sort of political multiculturalism that we've seen over the last few decades. I mean, how do you untangle that?
I think it's one of the most ignorant and pointless propositions that everyone has to accept.
Yeah.
We have lived through 40 years of right-wing rule in these countries. So from Margaret Thatcher onwards, let's say. During this time, the idea that political correctness took hold, and this is what's really causing all these problems, makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. That's the first thing. So to argue that, firstly, I deny that all white people are thinking this. I think this is kind of lazy journalism, which feeds into a particular kind of propaganda, which is arguing this. But you know what? If you just look at the records in the 60s and 70s, before Islamophobia became prominent within the UK as a organizing device, the same things were being said. I mean, so why is it that the same things were being said then, that it is white culture, which has always been this idea that any kind of racist, ethno-nationalist endeavor always leaves itself as being victimized. You have the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan in the United States saying that, they want to have a world safe for white children. In the United States, is it really white children which are the most at risk of death and deprivation? So I just think, firstly, we need to recognize what this is. And the idea is this, that those who are racially marked, those who are the ones which are the cause of this, it seems to me is a preposterous statement. Now, of course, there are many Muslims who make that statement. Just being a Muslim doesn't make you right all the time, I would say that. And there are many reasons for them to make that. But it's a fundamental misreading of the situation. If there are, I think, 40,000 churches in this country and 1,600 mosques, according to some information, I think the National Heritage. So where is this immense takeover? If this is an immense takeover, why is it that we have not been able to, on an issue that most, I would say, anecdotally, there's very few Muslims would not take the position of supporting what's happening, supporting Palestine. So if there was something, where is this evidence that we've been able to curtail the British support for the Zionist project, for the genocide, the complicity in genocide? Where has that happened? So in nearly every single case, what we are expected to believe that it is some kind of version that the Muslims are so empowered and so powerful that they are basically running everything. And the problem is that this is the kind of fantasy of no-go areas. This is the fantasy. These are racist tropes that come up again and again and again. I want to hope that maybe they would become a little bit more inventive and have better stories, but it's always the same kind of story at the same time. So I don't think there's any serious proposition that could make the case that it is they feel this. People may feel this, but what is the evidence for this? You know, and it doesn't make sense. So, for example, you know, many surveys have produced that chicken tikka masala is the most popular dish in the UK now. Okay, what harm is that doing? Firstly, it's not a Muslim dish necessarily. What has it done? What's the problem here? You know, now you could say, well, it's not, Britain isn't like it used to be in the 1950s. Yes, but no country is like it used to be in the 1950s. And there'll be many, many other transformations and things like that we can talk about. So I don't really see, I don't see any validity to that set of argument.
Yeah, I was in Qatar a few months back, and I was speaking to a Qatari who was trying to deal with, you know, the need for migration of his Qataris. Qataris are very small in number, and it's an economy that's really built on labor from mostly the subcontinent, but elsewhere. And he was, I suppose, bemoaning the idea that, look, the more migrants that come in, the more our culture, our Qatari culture becomes diluted, right? And I suppose in that context, I sat there and, you know, obviously I disagree, but at the same time, because they're mostly Muslims who were coming in, and, but at the same time, you know, I could accept that there was a Qatari culture and he's afraid that his culture is going to be diluted. And I suppose the argument then goes, well, why can't we accept that the Brits will have very similar
because
views?
that assumes that firstly, there's a static thing called culture. Let's take something which is typically British, you would argue, right? So we talk about British culture. Let's look at some of the practices. Fish and chips. When did fish and chips become central to British culture? Actually, it was during the First World War, when it was actually a cheap source of food and when there was a blockade going on.
Right.
Take, for example, the royal family. Well, the royal family had to change its name from Saxe-Coburg to Windsor during the First World War. Okay. They were Germans, right? And before that, they were French. So when does British culture become British culture? Take something like tea. Now, there's Yorkshire tea, but do you really think there are tea plantations in Yorkshire? Take sugar. Where does that come from? So the idea of what constitutes a culture is not something which is static and written, and that applies not just to the case of Britain or Qatar, etc. So it is how you build that culture itself. At one point, for example, you know, you would now consider, many people would consider that many of these communities, like the Huguenots or the other kind of minorities, were considered to be external to this culture. But culture is not something which is set in stone once and for all. You know, that's just not the case. And the idea that the Qataris feel that, well, I think it's not to do with so much with culture, it's to do with a particular vision of what a political community should be. And that in itself is a problem here. In a way that, why is it that a British culture cannot be inclusive of others who have been part of that story or can become part of that story? So I think we should think of culture as a story rather than a set of artifacts which have been there since the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, by the way, they were probably speaking French and not English. I mean, so none of these things make sense. You know, one of the things about the English monarchy, the Plantagenets, they actually were more concerned about their possessions in France, what we now call France. So where you draw the line of this culture is that you have a culture, you draw it through, for example, education, you draw it through broadcasting. Perhaps if you're really serious about a sense of British culture, your main concern would be the Americanization of British culture. It happened through Margaret Thatcher and all the reforms that ironically she brought in that actually led to an Americanization from things like, for example, high schools which have now prom, which in British high schools didn't used to have proms, you know, the same kind of thing, to high streets which have been completely transformed and saturated, mainly with American fast food or their imitations, or the kind of privatization and the kind of hollowing out of public institutions like the NHS or the universities or the BBC, where were the crucibles of a sense of Britishness which was distinct from, let's say, America or Europe, etc. So when you talk of those institutions, when you talk about culture, you're talking about institutions which house and curate those things.
Right.
And once you've said, well, we're just going to make them like little America, then maybe that's a bigger problem than Muslims turning buildings which were once churches, which are now derelict, into places of worship and prayer.
So neoliberalism has more to do with the dilution of British culture than migration.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about dilution of minorities and immigration, you notice that rarely people talk about the number of Americans who are migrants in this country or the French in this country. So this is why, in one way, the kind of racialized logic doesn't go away at the same time. And I can tell you that if it were French people who were Muslim, they would still be considered problematic because they'd be considered part of a Muslim kind of migration rather than a French migration, etc.
A lot of Muslims in Britain come from sort of a South Asian
Yeah, 70%
background.
of Muslims are from South Asian backgrounds.
I've noticed that American Muslims, who are generally more well-to-do or more well-heeled, they're economically far more progressed, let's say, than British Muslims are. They tend to sort of scoff, let's say, at British Muslims and argue that a lot of the sort of Islamophobia, the discontent that exists is because, a lack of integration and a lack of Muslims wanting in Birmingham, in Leeds, in other places, Muslim communities wanting to integrate into the whole, into Western culture. How do you tackle that type of conversation with our brothers and sisters in America?
Oh, scoffing brothers and sisters, I think, is ever bane of every family. So I don't think that's an issue, though. But look, I think there's two things about it. A lot of the American Muslims, and remember, they're also enslaved American Muslims who actually make up probably the largest percentage. So one of the things that happened with a lot of the American Muslims who arrived, let's say, from South Asia or North Africa, etc., in the 60s and the 70s, etc., like you said, they came with this, they were definitely better educated, but they also bought into the American dream. They thought it was possible for them to become this kind of sequence of hyphenated Americans. Until, of course, 9/11 happened. And I know many, many cases where you had people whose brothers were in Harvard and, living the American dream, and then 9/11 comes up and they're caught up in FBI provocateur traps and things like that, and then they're sent to Guantanamo, etc. And now they suddenly find themselves, actually, we should have been listening to our African-American Muslim brethren who were telling us this is what it's like. So this is an educational experience for all. We've always known that there's always been in Muslim-Stan, among the Muslim Ummah, there's always been a percentage of the population which one Iranian journalist called very famously West-toxicated. And they have, that's not that different because they're those people who think of themselves as being liberal and modern, etc., while they're shouting at their servants, of course, at the same time. And they have that sense that these are the same people who believe in democracy on international stages, but then they're in favor of, let's say, a military coup in Egypt to get rid of a directly elected president, and they're still hailed as being democratic, etc. Now, that's not just an Egyptian conceit. You'll find them everywhere. So, in a way, that kind of West-toxication that exists, and I would argue that many of the many members of the Muslim Ummah actually bought into the narratives around, this American dream. They didn't think that the colonial struggle had anything to do with them. They decided that actually this way of not understanding what America meant was a possibility for them. And I think many of them have come around to the fact, well, actually, we just had the killings in San Diego, when, for example, all the kind of changes associated with Trump. Do they really think that he doesn't mean Muslims? Now, this is a complex kind of thing because they will find Muslims who will say, I'm a Muslim, but I support Trump. And, there are groups called Muslims for Trump or whatever. But that shouldn't surprise us because, again, the whole history of colonialism, there were always people within those colonized spaces who were basically complicit with colonial rule, supporting it, fighting for it, dying for it. And some were and some were not. So I don't think that's strange in a way.
Yeah.
Though I think the scoffing might change a little bit because ultimately it's to do with the fact that a level of political and strategic literacy. And one of the things I think in the United States might have been that there was the experience of colonialism was seen to be something that didn't affect people. So most people from South Asia or North Africa or the Middle East would have parents or grandparents who actually were involved in the anti-colonial struggles. Either they witnessed it or they would have been touched by it, mobilized by it.
Yeah.
So they had some understanding of some of these kinds of what it meant. And they may not be able to articulate it very well because there is no space for that articulation. There's no space for them to tell those stories. But if you talk to them and you listen, you can see those elements have come through that. And perhaps those who were went to America in those period were not aware or didn't allow themselves to be educated in those things. And now they're finding that they may need to be educated better.
Now, you've described Islamophobia as the grammar of the world order. Can you unpack that for us? Grammar, why describe it as grammar?
A grammar is basically tells you how to put together things, put together words. So, for example, if I said to you in English, big house, big goes first in the house. If I say it in Sumerian, it would be it will be house big. Now, you wouldn't say to me, well, this is wrong, one is wrong or the other. It would just depend on what language you're speaking, which will be the correct thing. So in Spanish, you can say this is a blue table. In English, you would say, Spanish you say table blue. English, you say blue table. Does it change anything? No. So the first thing about the idea of grammar is that it looks at how things are put together. It doesn't really focus upon what it is like underneath that. So when we talk about Islamophobia as being the grammar of the kind of, as a kind of a grammar, what it means is that right now, throughout the world, there are certain things that are put together in certain ways to produce particular kinds of meanings and particular kind of understanding. So if I gave you a statement from the Indian Ministry of Interior, Home Office, or the Chinese Ministry of Interior, or Tel Aviv's equivalent, and I took out the names and they were talking about terrorism, I would suggest to you that you could not tell me which is from which ministry, because they would be using a similar kind of language, they'll be using the similar kind of methods. For example, when the Hindutva talk about using the template of Palestine in Kashmir, when, for example, they use the bulldozers to demolish Muslim houses, this is what the Zionists have been doing in Palestine. So so the grammar, in a sense, is this, that there's ways of you putting down things. The meaning of things is constructed by the way that they're put next to each other. So when you talk about, for example, fanaticism, when you talk about terrorism, it becomes coded. You don't often need to say anything else. And that's how we understand the world. And how we understand the world means this is how we comport ourselves to it, how we think we need to act in it. Look at all the remedies that they come up with. All the various countering violent extremism programs throughout the world have a similar kind of logic. That rather than agreeing or accepting that there is Islamophobia in play, rather than accepting that there are Muslim concerns, there's always this idea, well, this is a form of pathology, this is a form of madness, this is sort of cult behavior, etc., and this is what we need to do it. How do you identify it? Signs of radicalization, rather than saying signs of mobilization. Give you an example that I think everyone, certainly in Western Europe, can admit to. Not far from here, there is the University College of Slavonic Studies, which up till about a few months ago, probably still now, I haven't checked, has on its main entrance the Ukrainian flag. I would imagine there's hardly a Middle Eastern Studies department in any university in the UK which flies a Palestinian flag in its entrance, right? Even though now Palestine has been recognized by Britain, you still have incidents of police officers asking Palestinian flags to be taken down because it's supposed to be an affront to women. Now, this is something that's happened in the experience of school children. When Ukraine happened, there was almost this kind of compulsory, or at least a mobilization people should be wearing in defense of Ukraine. When the genocide in Gaza accelerates, this kind of solidarity became a site for investigation, interruption, threats on students and others around that. Now, you know, this is something that most people could say, well, what's the difference? But that's what I mean by the question of the grammar, that once you start putting these things together, then the meaning becomes quite explicit. Like grammar is basically how any sentence in any particular language works. What are the kind of order that you put these things together, and how you create meaning. So meaning is a property of sentence, it's a property of, it's not a property of the thing in itself. And that, I think, is why we can understand the war on terror and its allied campaigns, wherever they may be, through that logic, because Islamophobia puts certain things together and makes it possible of everyone to understand what they mean, and then to raise positions, mobilize against that. This thing about, you talked about the dilution of culture before, but one of the main factors has always been the idea that Muslims are going to become the largest group in France, or they were going to rule France, or in India, or whatever. I mean, these are very similar tropes, regardless of the demographic possibilities of that or not. So that's what I think the way the grammar is, that it's really about thinking how we understand the world, and what is the order of things, the sequencing of things that we put down to understand that world.
I think a lot of us saw it, that when the genocide was at its peak in Gaza, we almost had like a tap that was turned on of Islamophobia. And across the West, articles were appearing that presented Muslims in a very negative light. And, BBC headlines tended to focus in on individual anecdotal cases. And there was this almost a slew of anti-Muslim vitriol that was coming out of the media. Like, what is that connection between genocide and Islamophobia?
Islamophobia can go from microaggressions to genocide. I mean, I think we have to understand that, Islamophobia, often when people focus on it, they think about media misrepresentation, right? Or things like that, or hijab being pulled on. But I would argue that Islamophobia should be seen as a continuum. And therefore, you can start off with what you may consider to be relatively minor things, or at least individual things. But then it can go all the way to genocide. And remember, what's happening in Gaza isn't the first genocide that Muslimness has been targeting. Before that, there's the Rohingya, what's happening, Kashmir, Uyghurs, etc. Bosnia. Right? And in the case of Bosnia, which is interesting, because again, they were supposed to be European, but their Muslimness meant they weren't really European. Many of them only became aware they were Muslims when the ultra-nationalists came knocking on their door. And the violence that was meted onto their bodies, and the violence that they were subject to. The idea that genocide, but what makes genocide possible? Genocide really just happens out of the blue. You're preparing the ground. All the genocides we know have been based around preparing the ground, and preparing the ground not necessarily purposefully. I'm not saying there's one person directing all of these things, and I think we need to get away from that idea. But you're changing the culture. You're saying, okay, these things are possible. So one of the things that happens is that, for example, you could say that what happened to the Rohingya raises the bar on the value of Muslim livelihood and Muslim lives. If you can do this to the Rohingya, well, why not do it to the Kashmiris? If you can do this to the Chechens, if you can do it to the Bosnians, then what does it matter? Why can't you do it to others? So I think that's the first thing I would want to say.
Yeah.
And genocide, there are intermediate stages. There's, for example, apartheid.
Yeah.
So if you think about logic of racism eventually leads to annihilation. I mean, what I say eventually doesn't mean it's always there, but one can go to that.
Yeah.
You can also have a stage of segregation, apartheid. And one could argue that, in many ways, what you see in Islamophobia is an attempt to install a kind of a soft apartheid in most of the European countries. So take, for example, some of the legislation that's been introduced since the so-called war on terror. Conditional citizenship. If you are a Muslim, now your citizenship can be revoked. Now, you could say, well, in the US now, they're moving away from denaturalizing people who are citizens even. So it's not just being born, etc. Similarly, you could argue that take the legislation on surveillance. We know that the proliferation of surveillance cameras, etc., tend to be in areas which were heavily populated by Muslims. But we also know that that surveillance that was supposed to be only used in very extreme cases then began to be used by people having a dig at their neighbors, etc., or the people who were administrating the surveillance became more interested in settling quarrels or dealing, themselves. So we have a huge, everything becomes surveillance in a sense. So it may start off with the Muslims or the radical Muslims, then it becomes the Muslims, and then it becomes everyone else. So one of the things that Islamophobia is doing is changing the social contract between rulers and ruled everywhere, and turning even those countries which consider themselves democracies, turning it into a kind of spectator sport. You get a vote once in a while. And one of the main features of this, if you remember, one of the complaints used to be that Muslims don't get involved. Then when Muslims began to mobilize against the war on terror or against genocide, now the complaint is that they're too involved. So we always fail the Goldilocks test. Either we are too uninvolved or not involved, etc. So it seems to me that, this is the issue is this, that we have to think of Islamophobia as a systemic feature. It's not just about individuals. If you apply for a job and you have the same CV and the same application as someone whose name might be, let's say, Samuel Huntington, let's say, for some reason, there, just out of curiosity.
Yes.
We have seen many studies done, many countries, which show that markers of having a Muslim name means that you're less likely by a huge amount to be shortlisted or interviewed. Now, as a Muslim, you're not going to know about this. Because if you get rejected from a job, unless you have some sort of Trumpian narcissism syndrome, you think, oh, well, there might be better people or, better qualified. You wouldn't know that.
No.
So it also works systematically. If you look at, for example, the way in Muslimness accounts for, in this country, poor housing, where Muslims are concentrated on employment. All of these issues are also Islamophobic in a way. They're not just about, headlines in the Daily Express or the Sun. And I think that's one of the things we need to get across, that Islamophobia, when we call it a type of racism is a system. It's not just attitudes. It's actually something which is embodied in institutions and practices and protocols.
And how far does, your work is deeply rooted in decolonial thought. How does colonial history of Muslim majority societies shape Islamophobia and how it's playing out today?
It's quite clear that there is a relationship between colonialism and racism that we don't talk about enough. So oddly enough, if you look at the three main kinds of forms of racism that people talk about, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism itself, the category of racism is the sort of the most recent kind of one. It was coined more or less in the 1930s, right? Islamophobia was coined somewhere like at the beginning of the 20th century, right? And anti-Semitism, actually it was before that, it was actually the first record that we have is about the 1850s. Just around about 10, 15 years later, anti-Semitism takes off.
Yeah.
The thing is this, that all of these three terms have a kind of a familiar relationship to each other. Yeah. And in a way that racism operates, the way we understand racism and the way that we understand Islamophobia, is that we need to get away from thinking of them as simply individual prejudices. Right. That there's somebody who's a racist who has some kind of antagonism to Muslims or whatever. Going back to the example that I used before about the airport security. When you go through airport security, many of the people who are in security are recognizably Muslim. But they have been trained to spot Muslims and treat them slightly differently. How does that happen? These are the kind of practices we want to embed it. Now, the thing with the colonial element is this, what the decolonial does, and I would say that my work is more now really about critical Muslim studies. What the decolonial does is allow us to understand things better by understanding how they're linked together. So take, for example, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Now, when we know that many African-American men get killed by the police on a regular basis. And when that happens, to go back to the grammar, what does normally happen is that we say this was done because it was one bad apple, a bad policeman, accident happens, etc. Following the murder of George Floyd, the United States saw some of the largest multi-ethnic, multi-religious mobilizations in protest. How? Because what it was possible to see this murder as not just an individual action from Minnesota, but part of a larger history, part of a larger context, going back to the slave protest, which means that policing in the United States was already inflected with these racial logics. And by seeing it as part of something more than just one thing, one isolated incident, you were able to mobilize people. So one of the things that the idea of the decolonial critical Muslim studies does is really to show how many of the techniques and the systems of oppression and violence that exist are not necessarily just random individual acts. And that, I think, is really, really important. So, for example, when you go on a pro-Palestinian march, I would imagine in most places on this planet, the majority of people who are marching are not Palestinians. They're not Arabic speakers. At least a substantial number of them would be Muslims. If you took the Muslims away from those marches, they would probably reduce to 20,000, 30,000, whatever, rather than the 100,000 plus. Why is it that so many Muslims drape themselves in the Palestinian colors? Why is it so many people in South Africa, who's only 1% of the population Muslim, drape themselves in Palestinian colors? Why is it when Hasina was overthrown in Bangladesh, the two flags that were prominent among the demonstrators, the protesters who overthrew her, was the Bangladeshi flag, well, that stands to reason, and the Palestinian flag? Why is it that you can tell the status of a country's ability to have accountability depending on whether they allow even Muslim countries, people to fly Palestinian flags? In countries like, for example, Pakistan, there's a huge control over the ability to even protest, even though the people, by all indications, are fully supportive of the Palestinian cause. Yeah. But their ability to express that is heavily constrained. So what the decolonial does is make that bridge between something which is an individual or may look like episodic, and gives you an explanation to saying, look, this is part of a something bigger than that. And it's only by having that explanation that you're able to actually do something about it, that you're able to kind of mobilize against it. Because otherwise, you could simply say, well, terrible what's happening in Gaza, but I'm not Gazan. Terrible what's happening in Palestine, but I'm not Palestinian. So you need some act of translation that you say, okay, those Palestinian children or those Palestinian people, here's something about them that we need to be involved in, that we feel that experience in a way. And that, I think, is the act of what the decolonial has done, is seeing demonstrated that the contemporary landscape needs to be decolonized because the colonial system built this hierarchy, and colonialism and racism were basically the same thing. So the point that I was trying to make is that in the 1930s, when the word racism began to be used to describe what the Nazis were doing in Germany, but the Nazis were not doing, up till at least 1941, anything in Germany that wasn't being done by the British, the French, the Dutch, the Americans. But that was called colonialism. So we had to invent a different word to preserve the special case of Europe. And when Hitler and many of the Nazis talk about it, they say what they're doing is bringing colonialism to Europe. One of the critics, Cesar, writing in 1950, said Nazism is simply imperialism and colonialism brought home to Europe. The British, were the model for Hitler and Himmler. Himmler wanted the SS to be based on their schools, on the Eton and Harrow and British public school education. Hitler writes about turning Russia into ruling Russia like the British ruled India. So we have colonialism and we have racism. We then divide those two things, and what the decolonial does is say, look, racism and colonialism actually belong together. And what that does is allow us to think properly the context of where we find ourselves. And that, I think, is it's a kind of main project.
And Dr. Sayyid, can I ask, if there obviously are very good people that we interact with on a daily basis here in the West who are not part of this sort of systemized racial enterprise, and who support Palestinian rights, who have got very strong empathy for the challenges that minorities and Muslims go through. So there's a substantial base of a large number of non-Muslims. I would say maybe the majority actually of non-Muslims that we interact with on a daily basis are good people, and they recognize the inequalities that exist in the world, and maybe more so today because the Gaza genocide is just so visceral and so obvious to them. How do we engage with that constituency of people who've in many ways have woken up to this sort of colonial enterprise?
I think it's a really, really important point you made, and I think it's important to bear in mind that we don't fall into the trap of seeing everyone. When we talk about, for example, Islamophobia, doesn't mean that everybody is an Islamophobe, because I'm not sure that would be very useful. But this is a bigger problem here, and that's how we explain how things happen. Since 2016, I think Britain's had about 6 prime ministers. 7, yeah. 7, I think. Nearly 8. I don't know, I can't keep up now, right?
Yeah.
If you put them in any kind of gathering, you would say these 6 people, whoever they were, are incredibly different personalities, right? But if you look at what they actually have done so far and are doing, there isn't that much to choose between them. Yeah. So it goes to show the limits of individuals when we're talking about something systemic and structural. They're having to deal with the fact that Brexit has produced a lot of problems that they don't have the bandwidth to deal with, not because of individual failings necessarily. It's simply they've trapped themselves in a picture they can't get out of. So that's the first element. And the reason why I mention this is that there are many, many good people. And the point for us is to try and change and mobilize that those good people become culturally significant. Because what really is the case is how you transform the common sense of any society. I don't know if you're a football supporter or not a football fan.
Moderately, Liverpool.
Moderately.
Yes.
Yeah, but you have to be moderate if you're going to be Liverpool anyway. But leaving aside speaking as someone who just won the premiership there, so that was, not that I did it myself, of course, but I was there. There. But if you look at the way, at least on the premiership clubs, right, you look at the experience of black footballers who were playing in the 1980s, and you talk to them now, because they couldn't even talk about it, and they tell you about how horrific the abuse they felt, how it got to them.
Yeah.
And many of them were able to say this when they were playing. And you've gone from a situation where when there used to be kind of racial abuse directed at them, and all the commentators would say, oh, it's a bit of banter, it's not a big thing, whatever, to a situation, at least among the elite clubs, that you can have people in the crowd telling the stewards this person is making racist abuse, white people, and have that escorted out. Now, how is it that we've changed in that way, where racism was considered not to be something to be bothered about, to a situation that we feel as an affront, as part of a general common sense? So for me, the issue isn't about individuals in a way. It is to recognize that possibility of changing the culture and changing the common sense. And in a way that I think you're quite right, when we look at the polling evidence around support for the Palestinians has started emerging. But how has it emerged? When you had almost 800,000 people marching, some of the, in London, for example, part of it was some of those people were marching who've never marched before.
No.
It was also a process of education. There are people who started learning about what was happening. And part of, Thinking Muslim and other kind of platforms and things like that, and books and schools and whatever, is to educate the people in those things. Yeah. And doing that is really how you expand the kind of diet of empathy that we can have, who we can feel empathy for. But empathy is not enough. It really requires political mobilization to say that we have to do something about this. And that is, I think, a task for all of us. But it requires us to understand this is not about individual failings. It's about, going back to what I said about the grammar, changing how we put things together. And, take another thing. Why is it that now very few people smoke? In the 80s and the 70s, everyone smoked. Somehow, people stopped smoking. Something changed. And it changed through educational campaigns. It changed through changing health warnings and price of cigarettes. But ultimately, it changed because people were persuaded. And once they were persuaded, then you started restricting the spaces for that. You were able to do this campaign. So it seems to me that there are many, many historical examples that we can see. It's very difficult, for example, to find any white South African who will tell you now they supported apartheid. It seems apartheid happened completely absent-mindedly because no one actually supported it. So these sorts of things we know happen. We know that the change is possible. And there are people of goodwill. But the thing is that we need to connect them with each other, and we need to connect them in terms of having an alternative narrative that makes the world explicable rather than being explicable only in the terms of an Islamophobic story.
And so finally, as we wrap this conversation, it's been really fascinating conversation on Islamophobia. Like, how do we as Muslims resist this onslaught? I mean, you meet a number of Muslims who are now talking about Hijrah, leaving the country and going to a Muslim country, and that obviously comes with its own challenges.
A lot of them want to go to UAE, which is also problematic.
Well, exactly.
Go to center of Islamophobia.
Absolutely. How do we respond? Because it just seems like it's becoming so visceral, and the Tommy Robinson demonstration was very threatening, of course, to young Muslims, to women. How do we resist this onslaught?
I think there's two things. Firstly, I think we should be active in reminding people that this is not something that we cannot resist. That I think is really, really important. You talk about the demonstrations in the United Kingdom, but what about in the 60s and the 70s, when you had people like Enoch Powell, who could have been a prime minister? You had the kind of everyday racism and everyday violence that was unmitigated and unmitigated. That also happened. And, people who were around then will tell you what they had to go through as well. So it is something that can be resisted. But in all of that, I think the most important thing to do is that it goes back to the point about the Hijrah. Well, the Hijrah, and like I say, I know from a colleague who's been doing data, for example, on French Muslims who are really having it. France is one of the most Islamophobic countries in the European Union, if not in the world. Yeah. And many of them are leaving. But one of the places they're going to is the UAE. And that seems to me there's a lack of kind of a critical thinking about what are we facing. So the idea that you can have a country like UAE or others being Islamophobic is something that most Muslims doesn't cross most Muslims' minds. So I think firstly is that kind of getting aware of what the fight is. So to develop strategies of counter-Islamophobia, we need to actually understand and accept that Islamophobia is a problem. And it is a problem for everyone. This is one of the things that we need to have an understanding of Islamophobia, which doesn't have to be a legal understanding, but it should be something that robust enough that a 10-year-old child can actually say, this is what more or less Islamophobia means. In the way that now most people understand or can give you some idea what racism is, which may not be a legal definition, it may not be a regulatory definition, but it kind of gets to, they know what it looks like. So that, I think, is one of the first things we have to do. And that means that, organizations, not just of Muslims, but of those organizations who want to see a better social contract between rulers and ruled, need to understand that if the fight against Islamophobia is really not just a fight for Muslims, it's a fight for a different vision of a society in which you can have a greater level of freedom, you can have a greater level of being yourself, and in a society in which there is greater kind of diversity and a kind of commitment to some kind of a notion of multiculturalism in a way. And I think it's important to see that you're actually better in that type of coming back. So I think those are the kind of things we have to think, that fighting Islamophobia is more than that. It's more than just fighting for Muslims. It's fighting for a different kind of vision of society, which is inclusive and future-orientated. And that, I think, is really, really important. And this is why I talk about Islamophobia, colleague Abdul Karim Vakil, we talk about it as something which targets expressions of Muslimness. Because the thing is that we know cases where many people who've gone on pro-Palestinian marches who are not Muslim, who are being treated as they were Muslims by the police, by the authorities, etc. And that can be sometimes officially, or it can be sometimes informally. So in a sense, Muslimness now stands in this time as something which all ethno-nationalists reject. And therefore, it seems it's important for Muslims to cultivate a sense of itself, that it is something which transcends this kind of ethno-nationalism. That's what makes it significant. And that's why Islamophobia is really an attempt to have the revenge of the ethno-nationalists. And that is what has to be fought.
Professor Salman Sayyid, it's really been an honor, a pleasure speaking to you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Assalamu alaikum. Now you've reached the end of this show, and the fact that you've stayed until the very end tells me that you truly believe in our work. Please consider making a one-off donation or becoming a member by visiting thinkingmuslim.com/membership. Now your contributions give you exclusive behind-the-scenes access and the ability to ask questions to our guests, and monthly calls with myself, my team, and our guests like Sami Hamdi. Jazakallah khair, and keep us in your du'as.